All throughout America's history, there have been all kinds of movements to fight for the rights of marginalized communities. Civil rights, women's rights, LGBT rights. But did you know there was also a movement for the rights of people with disabilities? And that movement isn't a thing of the past, but still ongoing to this day? Do you want to learn more about it? Well, that's what we're going to do in today's video, the Disability Rights Movement Explained. But before we discuss how people with disabilities have made themselves more visible and become more humanized and accepted in American society, I should probably introduce myself to anyone who's new to my channel. I'm Laura Youngblood, and here at From Laura's Perspective, I post a new video essay on a different topic at least once a week. Each essay is on a different topic, and the categories of topics have been made into playlists on my channel page, so you're sure to find one that interests you, even if it's not history or social justice like today's. Either way, you have no excuse not to subscribe, and once you do, you need to tap the bell if you want to get the message every time something new comes to my video essay library. All right, ready to learn about the disability rights movement? Because it's time to start. First, I'm going to break down the timeline of this movement from its beginnings until now. As its name implies, the disability rights movement seeks to address stratification and inequalities between persons with disabilities and persons without disabilities, which has always put the former at a great disadvantage. It's over the past century that the rights of the disabled have had the most dramatic evolution in the United States. Even when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who used a wheelchair as a result of polio, became president of the United States, he went out of his way to hide his disability for fear that it could cause him to be seen as weak and incapable. Disabilities were viewed as a personal issue, and not many political or governmental organizations existed to support people who lived with them. In the 1950s, there was a transition to volunteerism and parent-oriented organizations, such as the March of Dimes. While this was the beginning of activism and seeking support for the disabled children were largely hidden by their parents out of fear of forced rehabilitation. When the women's rights and civil rights movements took off in the 1960s, disability advocates made their way into these movements, seeking to challenge common assumptions about disabilities and promote the treatment of the disabled as full-fledged members of society. Although the disabilities of disability advocates were all different, with some of these disabilities physical, others mental, and others visual and auditory, they all came together for the common cause of fighting for equal rights and opportunities. It wasn't until 1990 that the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was passed, legally prohibiting discrimination on account of disability and mandating disability access in all buildings and public areas. The ADA is historically significant in that it defined the meaning of reasonable accommodation in order to protect employees and employers. Today, disability rights advocates continue protecting those who are discriminated against, including working towards issues like law enforcement and treatment of people with disabilities. The disability rights movement seeks to knock out 3 specific barriers to inclusion for people with all kinds of disabilities. Here's what they are. For a long time, it's been believed that a person's impairment makes them inherently unfit to do certain things and be full-fledged members of the society. But the social model of disability disputes this, claiming that disabled people are not the problem, but rather the problem is the way society is set up and how it blocks their access to things. Society sets up barriers for people with disabilities in 3 forms. The first is attitudinal barriers. These are created when people associate the disabled only with their disability. An attitudinal barrier can include anything from low expectations of people with disabilities to slurs and crude comments about them. Attitudinal barriers allow the next two types of disability barriers to form and persist. The second is environmental barriers. These are natural or built spaces that aren't accessible by people who use mobility aids, such as cramped spaces through which wheelchairs can't fit and steep staircases but no ramps or elevators. Last but not least are institutional barriers. These include laws, policies, practices, or strategies that discriminate against people with disabilities. For example, a study of 5 Southeast Asian countries found that electoral laws do not specifically protect the political rights of persons with disabilities, while some banks do not allow visually disabled people to open accounts, and HIV testing centers often refuse to accept sign language interpreters due to confidentiality policies. Restrictive laws exist in some countries, particularly affecting people with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. So what exactly does this movement fight for and against? Historically, people with all kinds of disabilities have faced attitudinal, environmental, and institutional barriers to full access in society. But these have always looked a little different depending on the disability in question. Whatever barrier comes with each kind of disability, the disability rights movement sought to combat that. One of the biggest barriers for people with physical disabilities is public spaces and buildings that are set up in such a way that one cannot access it with a wheelchair, walker, crutches, or other mobility aid. It was thanks to people who fought in the disability rights movement that mobility aid users can access all kinds of buildings because they now have elevators, automatic doors, wider doors and halls, transit lifts, wheelchair ramps, and curb cuts. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities dedicated themselves to the movement as a way to ensure their human rights. Out of this even came its own self-advocacy movement. The name self-advocacy refers to how people with I/DD have often been spoken over by people without IDD trying to stand up for them. At the dawn of both the disability rights and self-advocacy movements in the 1960s, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, with Down syndrome and cerebral palsy being just 2 examples, were confined to institutions and asylums, never allowed to work or attain an education. The group homes many of them live in today, one of which I actually work at, are a far superior alternative to asylums and generally take pretty good care of their clients. However, they're often underfunded and have high staff turnover. For a long time, anyone diagnosed with any form of developmental disability was forced into guardianship and to live in one of these homes without any say in the matter. IDD activists fought for the right they now have to choose whether or not to be placed under guardianship and to determine for themselves whether or not they can live independently. Within these homes, the disability rights movement also sought to combat the once alarmingly high rates of abuse and neglect of individuals living in these homes. Abuse and neglect includes inappropriate seclusion and restraint, inappropriate use of force by staff, threats, harassment, and/or retaliation by staff, failure to provide adequate nutrition, clothing, and/or medical and mental health care, and/or failure to provide a clean and safe living environment, as well as other issues which pose a serious threat to the physical and psychological well-being of a person with a disability. With the help of disability rights activists, there are strictly enforced laws in place to prevent these things from happening in group homes and to severely punish any staff member who abuses or neglects a client. To this day, people with INDD push for the sheltered workshops they work in to be bound by the FLSA and forced to pay them at least minimum wage. Another issue is the continued dehumanization of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which prompted the slogan "People First," which is still used as a rallying cry and common organizational name in the self-advocacy movement. Self-advocates are also involved in the R-word campaign, in which they try to eliminate the use of the word retard. The developmental disability of autism, which I myself have, actually has a rights movement of its own, similar to that of self-advocacy for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Autism has been long thought of as a disease in need of a cure, but the autism rights movement views the autism spectrum as a result of natural variations in the human brain. The autism rights movement advocates for several goals, including greater acceptance of autistic behaviors, therapies that focus on coping skills rather than imitating the behaviors of neurotypical peers, the creation of social networks and events that allow autistic people to socialize on their own terms, and the recognition of the autistic community as a minority group. This movement has been dismissed on the assumption that most of its members are relatively high functioning. Those who oppose this movement often bring up those on the lower functioning end of the spectrum, arguing that those guys may or may not want to be cured. Ironically, this argument is usually given by someone who is not on the spectrum themselves. So what were some of the biggest turning points in the disability rights movement's timeline? In the 1960s, Edward Roberts led fellow wheelchair users in a huge movement called independent living. A subset of the disability rights movement, the independent living movement postulates that people with disabilities are the best experts on their own needs, and therefore they must take the initiative individually and collectively in designing and promoting better solutions and must organize themselves for political power. Besides deprofessionalization and self-representation, the independent living movement's ideology comprises demedicalization of disability, deinstitutionalization, and cross-disability. Cross-disability is the inclusion in the independent living movement of all people with disabilities, regardless of their specific diagnosis. But this was a little harder for people who had mental disabilities. Although these people are very smart, they had a much harder time articulating their thoughts and expressing their emotions. This, in the eyes of society, contradicted the notion that people with mental disabilities were the experts of their own impairment. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was written into law. Sections 501, 503, and 504 prohibited discrimination in federal programs and services and all other programs or services receiving federal funds. Key language in the Rehabilitation Act found in Section 504 states, "No otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States shall, solely by reason of his handicap, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." Today, the use of the word handicap in such a document is politically incorrect, and disability is used in its place. The Act also specifies money that can be allocated to help disabled people receive training for the workforce, as well as to assist in making sure that they can then reach work without running into inaccessibility problems. This was the first civil rights law guaranteeing equal access for people with disabilities. But Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act wouldn't even matter if it weren't for a historic event known as the 504 sit-in. This 1977 sit-in took place at government buildings operated by the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or HEW. On April 5, 1977, activists began to demonstrate, and some sat in the offices found in 10 of the federal regions, including New York City, Los Angeles, Boston, Denver, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Atlanta. One of the most noteworthy protests, however, occurred in San Francisco. The protesters demanding the signing of regulations for Section 504. The successful sit-in was led by Judith Heumann, who I've actually made a video all about. The first day of protests marked the first of a 25-day sit-in. Close to 120 disability activists and protesters occupied the HEW building, and Secretary Joseph Califano finally signed on April 28, 1977. Not only did this protest achieve its goal, but it was the foremost concerted effort between people of different disabilities coming together in support of legislation that affected the overall disability population rather than just specific groups of disabled people. In 1978, just a year after the 504 sit-in, the Atlantis community gathered disability activists in Denver, Colorado to stage a sit-in and blockade of the Denver Regional Transit Authority buses. They were protesting the fact that the transit system was completely inaccessible for physically disabled people. This action proved to be just the first in a series of civil disobedience demonstrations that lasted for a year until the Denver Transit Authority finally bought buses equipped with wheelchair lifts. In 1983, Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, or ADAPT, was responsible for another civil disobedience campaign also in Denver that lasted 7 years. They targeted the American Public Transport Association in protest of inaccessible public transportation. This campaign ended in 1990 when bus lifts for people using wheelchairs were required nationwide by the Americans with Disabilities Act. That actually brings me to the next major event, which was the 1990 passing of the ADA. Closely modeled after the Civil Rights Act and Section 504, the law was the most sweeping disability rights legislation in American history. It mandated that local, state, and federal governments and programs be accessible, that employers with more than 15 employees make reasonable accommodations for workers with disabilities and not discriminate against otherwise qualified workers with disabilities, and that public accommodations such as restaurants and stores not discriminate against disabled people, and that they make reasonable modifications to ensure access for disabled members of the public. The act also mandated access in public transportation, communication, and in other areas of public life. Thank you so much for watching my video on the disability rights movement, how it all began, and why it matters today. It's thanks to disability rights activists and their efforts that people with disabilities can get an education, enjoy a lot of the same things non-disabled people do, and with progressing efforts, some can even go to college and hold down jobs. This movement means a lot to me as someone who lives with a disability herself. In case you didn't already know, I've even made a playlist called Disabilities, which includes any videos I have made or will make on the subject of disability. This playlist is linked up on your screen, as are some videos you might like if you liked this one. If this is the first of my videos you've seen, I hope it was a good introduction to my content and that you want to come back for more.